The day Charlotte Whitmore stepped into the Whitmore and Vale Law Firm's mahogany-paneled conference room, she wasn't the same girl who had been cast out of the family estate in a blizzard. 15 years earlier, she wasn't the trembling college freshman accused of betraying blood for daring to question her father's ethics. She wasn't the sobbing daughter disinherited by her billionaire grandfather, Gerald Whitmore, after a family vote sealed her fate. No, the woman who walked into that room in a tailored navy suit and heels that echoed like a countdown was precise, practiced, and colder than the New York wind outside. The room smelled like old cigars, scotch, and secrets, and seated around the glossy walnut table were the people who had once voted her into exile. Her uncles Raymond and Peter, her cousin Erica, and her Aunt Delilah, every one of them with eyes like wolves, wondering why the ghost they'd buried had returned in flesh and bone. Her name hadn't been spoken at Whitmore gatherings in years. Not since the incident. Not since she'd gone public with the truth about the company's shell accounts, illegal investments, and the hush money sent to cover up an executive scandal. They had called her reckless, a traitor, a disgrace. She called it justice. And they buried her with lies, revoked her trust, and used their influence to erase her from every board, scholarship, and media interview that followed. But they didn't kill her. They made her sharper. And now they were about to learn what happens when you build your empire on betrayal. And the one you betrayed learns how to burn it down. It all started with Gerald Whitmore's death, a quiet passing at his summer home in Nantucket, surrounded by enablers and lies. The man had ruled the family like a king, ruthless, sharp-witted, and obsessed with legacy. Everyone expected a clean handoff to Raymond, the eldest son. But Gerald, who had once been a titan of American real estate, had rewritten his will months before his death. No one knew except Charlotte, because Gerald, riddled with guilt and dying, had asked her to come to him, secretly, privately. He had found religion, or maybe just fear. I did terrible things, he'd told her, his voice thin, his skin paper. I should have protected you. I believed their lies. I let them vote on blood. Charlotte had said nothing. She simply listened. When he handed her the envelope signed, sealed, notarized, she took it with no visible emotion. It's all in there, he said. My final clause. My way of making it right. It was poetic, really. The man who exiled her had, in the end, given her the weapon to bring down everyone who did. That envelope was now in her leather briefcase, resting on the same table where she once sat coloring as a child during shareholder meetings. Back then, they smiled at her because she was quiet and easy to ignore. Now, they glared. The lawyer read the updated will aloud, and the room transformed with every line. The estate, valued at over $640 million, was no longer set to be evenly distributed among the remaining Whitmores. Instead, 51% was being transferred into a controlling trust, with Charlotte as the sole trustee. She didn't flinch, but the gasps were immediate. Peter cursed under his breath. Erica's face drained to white. Delilah stood up, furious only, to be reminded that objections had to be submitted in court. The will was airtight, and Gerald had left a video statement, his frail face appearing on the screen as the room dimmed. If you're watching this, he said, I'm gone, and I owe Charlotte what I didn't have the courage to give her while I was alive, power to choose. What to do with what I built. Then he added, and to the rest of you, you know what you did. Silence followed, and then chaos. But Charlotte didn't engage. She simply stood, collected the briefcase, and walked out of the conference room while her family shouted behind her, like dogs snarling behind a gate. That night, she moved into the family's Manhattan penthouse. The locks had already been changed. Her name was on every deed, and in her private folder were documents she had prepared long before Gerald's death records of financial laundering, internal bribes, misused charity funds, and offshore tax evasion. She hadn't come for revenge in theory. She had come with blueprints, and she was going to dismantle the Whitmore legacy piece by piece, until the world saw them not as elites but as rot disguised in pearls and property. The first blow Charlotte delivered was quiet but devastating: the revocation of Erica's position on the board of the Whitmore Philanthropic Trust. It was a role she'd held since college, given not through merit but inheritance, and one that allowed her to launder both influence and image. Charlotte didn't announce the termination. She let Erica discover it herself during a live donor gala, no less when her name was quietly removed from the program and her keycard access revoked from the building. The rage-filled voicemail Erica left that night was 3 minutes long, oscillating between threats, guilt trips, and desperate bargaining. Charlotte didn't respond. She was already onto the next move: the family's private equity portfolio, long protected by layers of shell companies. And off-the-record lobbying had been kept alive through silent partnerships with corrupt urban redevelopment firms. Charlotte leaked internal documents, too. An investigative journalist she once mentored an anonymous tip backed by files with names, dates, and damning bank transfers. Within a week, the story broke wide. Whitmore Holdings tied to predatory housing projects across 4 states. Headlines flashed, stock prices dropped. Politicians scrambled to return campaign donations. And Charlotte, she simply watched from her penthouse window, sipping black coffee as the city roared beneath her. Raymond was next. He had always fancied himself the heir apparent, the future Whitmore CEO, groomed in the shadows of Gerald's empire. But Charlotte knew where his skeletons were buried. She had the emails proving he siphoned funds from the Whitmore Disaster Relief Fund to bankroll private vacations and hush settlements from a harassment scandal in 2016. She had the legal drafts of a settlement NDA that had never been signed, written by a junior associate who, after being fired, had sent Charlotte everything in a flash drive with a note that simply said, "I believe you." She forwarded that drive to the Department of Justice, not under her name, under a whistleblower's. It was enough to open a full-scale investigation. When Raymond confronted her in the lobby of the building they both now technically owned, he tried to put on the old charm. "We're family, Char. We can handle this like adults." She looked him dead in the eye and replied, "Adults don't cover up crimes and call it tradition." Then she walked past him, leaving him in the marble silence, mouth slightly open like a fish out of water. But perhaps the most chilling move came when Charlotte visited Delilah, her once beloved aunt, the woman who had dried her tears as a child, and then turned on her like a viper when the scandal broke. Delilah had always painted herself as the matriarch of restraint and reason, but Charlotte knew better. She knew about the foundation funds that disappeared during Delilah's Paris excursions. She knew about the insider trading tips Delilah had whispered to her yoga friends, one of whom had flipped when the sec came knocking. Charlotte arrived unannounced at Delilah's brownstone with a thin envelope in hand. "What is this?" Delilah asked, the color draining from her face as she recognized the handwriting on the outside Gerald's. "It's the affidavit he never sent," Charlotte said, "naming you and Peter as co-conspirators in the forced disinheritance." Delilah tried to deny it, but Charlotte only smiled. "I'm not here to argue. I'm here to give you a choice. Step down quietly from all public-facing positions, or I'll release this letter and everything else I have to the press." There was a long silence. Then Delilah, for the first time in her life, simply nodded. No protest, just defeat. Charlotte's moves weren't fueled by rage or revenge in the petty sense. They were surgical, strategic, and each time she acted, she made sure to protect the innocents caught in the web. Low-level employees, interns, local organizations that had been unintentionally used as tools of corruption. She quietly rerouted grant money to support women's shelters and whistleblower funds. She rewrote bylaws that once gave board members lifetime control, replacing them with democratic voting structures. She turned the Whitmore Foundation into a vehicle for restorative justice. And yet, the public didn't know it was her. They saw headlines, Firings, audits, but not the woman behind the curtain. She liked it that way. Because this wasn't about fame. It was about the long game. The slow burn. The unraveling of power. Not just from her family's grip, but from the entire culture that had allowed them to thrive. Unchecked, still. There were nights when Charlotte stood alone on the penthouse balcony and let the weight of it settle on her shoulders. She wasn't made of ice. She felt it all, the betrayal, the abandonment, the ache of knowing no one in that house had ever truly loved her for her. But beneath that ache was something stronger, purpose, a fire that didn't rage, but simmered, constant, and controlled. She was remaking the empire not in their image, but in spite of it, and she was just getting started. The retaliation came not with fire, but with frost calculated, merciless, and expected. Charlotte had spent years studying how power defends itself when wounded, and the Whitmores were no exception. Her uncle Peter, quiet for most of the chaos, finally revealed his hand. He filed a countersuit, claiming Charlotte had manipulated their ailing father into rewriting the will under duress. The media pounced. Headlines speculated wildly. Heiress or hustler? Is the Whitmore princess power-hungry? Anonymous? Sources leaked troubled past stories-old psychiatric records from her college breakdown. Her disappearance from the public eye, even a fabricated claim that she'd once attempted suicide. The smear campaign was brutal. Her inbox filled with hate mail. Trolls flooded her author pages, calling her ungrateful, disturbed, vindictive. But Charlotte didn't crack. She'd been in the wilderness before, and this time, she had a map for every attack. She had a counter. Her legal team swiftly dismantled the duress claim with medical affidavits and a video of Gerald lucidly signing the documents in the presence of 3 neutral witnesses. The psychiatric smear. She released her own op-ed. Yes, I had a breakdown because this family broke me first. It went viral. Survivors rallied behind her. Hashtag Stand with Arlette trended across platforms. She didn't just win the public back. She controlled the narrative now. But damage still rippled through her world. An investor quietly withdrew from a major foundation partnership. One of her closest allies on the board stepped down under pressure from legacy donors. The family was bleeding. Yes, but Charlotte had to admit, so was she. She retreated for several days to the upstate farmhouse where she had written her first book. Her phone off, her laptop closed, alone in the quiet. She walked through the frost-bitten orchards behind the cabin and whispered her pain into the wind. She thought of the girl she'd been at 18, shivering in that snowstorm outside the Whitmore gates, her suitcases soaked, her voice ignored. "I'm not her anymore," she said aloud. But the truth was she was. She had taken that same brokenness and turned it into a blade. And now she needed to finish what she started. When she returned, it was with renewed clarity. She stopped playing defense and went for the jugular. She contacted the state attorney general's office with documentation outlining the Whitmore family's decades-long pattern of financial misconduct, tax fraud, and nonprofit embezzlement. Not just civil court anymore. This was criminal. She didn't just want them out of power, she wanted them exposed, prosecuted, and remembered for what they really were. Then, in a move no one expected, she called a press conference. Cameras flashed wildly as Charlotte walked onto the stage in a sleek black dress. Her expression a masterclass in composure. "I've spent my life being told to protect the family name," she said into the microphone. "But I've come to understand that loyalty to corruption is not honor its complicity. I will not protect abusers because we share DNA. I will protect the people they hurt." She held up a leather journal her grandfather's and read aloud one of the entries. He wrote before his death, "My legacy is not the buildings or the balance sheets. It's the people I failed to protect. I hope she forgives me." Cameras caught the tears welling in her eyes but not falling. She never let them fall in public. The press conference sparked national coverage. Former employees began reaching out with their own stories: administrative assistants, drivers, accountants. One of the most damning came from a woman named Isabel, who had worked for the family's legal team years earlier. She provided scanned documents that revealed Gerald had once paid off a building inspector to approve unsafe housing for a development Peter oversaw. The inspector died in a suspicious car crash 2 weeks later. Charlotte took that to the feds. Quietly, ruthlessly. She didn't brag. She didn't taunt. She simply set the fire, walked away, and let the system do the rest. Within weeks, subpoenas were issued. A federal investigation was underway. Raymond fled to Dubai. Erica went silent. Peter's countersuit was dropped. Delilah announced she was stepping away from public life indefinitely. Still, Charlotte remained, standing at the center of a storm she had not only survived but created. And though the media began to call her the woman who broke the Whitmores, she knew better. She hadn't broken them. She had simply stopped holding their lies together. And now that the scaffolding of silence had fallen, all that remained was truth and what she would build from its ashes. The fall of the Whitmore empire didn't happen with a bang. It collapsed like an old cathedral, crumbling under its own weight, brick by brick, until only dust and truth remained. The federal investigation led to formal indictments against Raymond and Peter on charges of tax fraud, securities violations, and obstruction of justice. Charlotte watched it unfold from the steps of the courthouse, where her grandfather had once donated $1 million to ensure the Whitmore name was etched above the doors. Now, reporters lined those same steps, documenting the trial not of a legacy family's triumph but of its reckoning. Charlotte didn't testify out of vengeance. She did it because history needed a witness. She took the stand with composure and clarity, outlining in chilling detail the decades of cover-ups, the coercion, the vote that stripped her inheritance and dignity in the same motion. She didn't tremble. She didn't shout. She let the facts speak. When the verdicts came in guilty on multiple counts, she didn't smile. She simply stood and walked out into the sunlight, the weight of a family name no longer anchoring her to silence. The media clamored for a quote, but all she said was, "This isn't the end of the Whitmores. It's the beginning of what comes next." What came next was not revenge but resurrection. Charlotte sold off large chunks of the family's real estate empire, transferring millions into educational programs for disenfranchised youth, women's legal defense networks, and systemic reform initiatives. She transformed the family's corporate headquarters, a towering symbol of greed, into a nonprofit institute for financial transparency and corporate ethics. She called it the Inheritance Project, a deliberate reclaiming of the very word once used to deny her future. Portraits of her father, uncles, and grandfather were removed from every building they once dominated. In their place were portraits of whistleblowers, activists, survivors, and reformers. Her face was not among them. "This was never about me," she told her board. "It was about breaking the pattern." And yet, healing was not linear. There were still nights she walked the penthouse halls, the same ones where her mother had once kissed her good night, now echoing with the silence of what could have been. She missed her mother sometimes, who had passed away quietly years before the scandal. Too worn down to fight, too loyal to speak. In the corner of the penthouse, Charlotte kept a single framed photo, the two of them at the beach. Charlotte, no older than 7, her mother shielding her from the wind with a towel. It was a reminder of love that had once lived in the cracks between the abuse. Not every Whitmore had been monstrous, but enough had, and enough had protected them. And that was all it took. When the final properties were transferred and the Whitmore name removed from all charitable and educational institutions, Charlotte returned to the place it all began, her grandfather's Nantucket house, now hers by law and legacy. She hadn't stepped inside since the day he'd handed her the envelope that changed everything. The air smelled of salt and cedar, and the house still creaked with memories. She didn't bring a film crew or photographer. No social media posts. Just herself, and the same briefcase she'd carried into the firm on day one. Upstairs, she entered Gerald's study, untouched since his death, and opened the same drawer where he had hidden his secrets for decades. She added one more letter of her own. To whoever finds this after me, it began. Know that silence is not safety. It is only the space where injustice survives. She folded the letter and left it in the drawer beside his, closing it slowly as the sun spilled through the lace curtains. A small act, but a necessary one. In the spring, Charlotte held a garden reception on the rooftop of the renovated headquarters. Gone were the marble busts of Whitmore men, now replaced by wildflowers, and a memorial plaque honoring survivors of corporate abuse. Dozens attended. Some came to support, some to apologize, others just to see what redemption could look like in brick and mortar. As twilight descended, Charlotte stepped forward to give a short speech. She wore no jewelry, no title badge, no designer label, just a quiet strength that filled the space louder than applause. "We're not here to bury history," she said. "We're here to rewrite it." She paused, then added, "Power doesn't corrupt. Power reveals. What you do when you have it, that's your legacy." The crowd stood in silence, then rose to clap, not because they were told to, but because they believed. In the years that followed, Charlotte never went back to the family estate in Connecticut. She left it untouched, gated, preserved, and eventually donated as a historical cautionary site for systemic abuse. She never wrote another memoir, never took another interview. She taught a few lectures, mentored young women, sat in courtrooms quietly supporting other cases like hers. But mostly, she lived. Not extravagantly, not reclusively, but freely. She gardened. She adopted a rescue dog. She learned to sleep without locking every door. And in the evenings, she'd sometimes sit by her fireplace, reading letters from strangers who wrote to say, "Thank you." Letters that began with "because of you." Those were her true inheritance.